It is a bitter winter night in the year 1371. The wind howls through the crooked alleys of a town that doesn't yet exist on any modern map. The muddy streets stink of damp hay rotting food, and worse. Somewhere in the gloom, a stray dog yelps as a drunkard kicks it away from a half-chewed pig's trotter. Nearby, a wooden door creaks open. A warm orange glow spills out. Laughter follows. Laughter and the heavy scent of smoke, sweat, mead, and boiling onion stew. You step inside. Welcome to the medieval tavern. A place that wasn't just for ale and laughter, but a volatile crucible of gossip, violence, secret deals, infidelity, and occasional. You weren't just a customer here. You were a witness to something utterly alive, strange, and very real. This was the pulse of the medieval world. And no, despite what your school textbooks whispered between the lines, this isn't going to be a tale about nobles sipping wine by the fire or knights dueling for honor. You're about to sit on a lice-infested bench next to a pockmarked archer who hasn't bathed in 3 months, while a blind minstrel sings about a noble who did something incredibly obscene with a chicken. We begin in the heart of England, though it might just as well be France, Germany, or the Low Countries. Because wherever you went in medieval Europe, taverns followed you like shadows. They were the social glue for the poor, the ticking time bombs for the anxious authorities, and the unlikely incubators of rebellion, romance, and ruin. But first, what was a tavern? The word itself, taverna, is older than the Middle Ages. It goes back to the Romans, who themselves borrowed it from the Greeks. A place of food and drink, yes, but more than that, a place of talk. Of loose tongues and loose morals. After Rome fell and the lights of empire dimmed, the tavern didn't die. It mutated, it adapted. It clung to the bones of the past and grew fangs. By the 13th century, in a world where most people lived and died within 10 miles of their birthplace, taverns were the rare places where stories traveled faster than men. A monk in Canterbury might hear about a strange plague in Venice long before the rats carried it to his doorstep, thanks to a trader who spilled the news between gulps of sour ale. Forget everything you think you know about medieval beer. The stuff wasn't just a drink, it was survival. Water was often contaminated. Children drank ale. The elderly drank ale. And the tavern was where it flowed. Thick, unfiltered, warm ale. Sometimes flavored with herbs, sometimes with whatever could be found. Nettles, honey, tree bark, even hallucinogenic mushrooms in the wilder corners of the continent. You'd walk in, shaking off the cold, and the smell would hit you first. Wet wool, burning peat, stewed cabbage. Then you'd hear the sounds. Wooden dice slapping against the table. An old woman yelling at a pig that had wandered inside. A man retching in the corner while a serving girl with a face like a dried apple tried to clean it up with a rag that had been washed since the king's coronation. And the people, the people. Farmhands with cracked fingers stained from the soil. Traveling minstrels with lies for songs. Prostitutes with hearts of gold or pockets full of thieves. Mercenaries, freshly bloodied from the Breton War, drinking beside novice monks who swore they only came in to observe sin. Even local lords disguised, of course, sometimes ventured in, hungry for scandal or distraction. You didn't sit wherever you liked. There was an order to things, invisible to outsiders but well known to the regulars. The long benches near the hearth were for the locals. Newcomers were scrutinized, watched, sometimes challenged. And the innkeeper, often a former soldier or a widow with scars, both literal and not, watched everyone. Money, rarely coins. More often bartered favors, gossip, or future promises. Put it on my tab was as dangerous then as it is now. Maybe more so because a tab unpaid could end in exile, broken limbs, and yet, despite the danger, Despite the chaos, the tavern was home. A place of community, where marriages began and sometimes ended, where revolts were whispered, where songs were born, where enemies became friends and friends. Enemies. Take the story of Old Rollo's Tavern in York, 1422. Legend has it, a Welsh trader once bragged too loudly about cheating the king's tax collector. What he didn't know? The tax collector's cousin was 3 pints deep at the other end of the table. 1 hour later, the trader was strung up from the rafters with his own belt. But no one remembers the death. They remember the song that came after, the one the bard composed in real time, rhyming Rollo with swallow in ways no one expected. But not all taverns were the same. Some were elegant by medieval standards, especially in cities like Bruges or Florence. These urban taverns catered to wealthy merchants. There, your ale might come in a polished pewter tankard. You'd get meat on a plate instead of fish bones in a bowl. You might even, if you were lucky, encounter a tavern with separate rooms, beds, and something resembling privacy. But make no mistake, even the best taverns were noisy, smoky, and utterly alien to modern comfort. You'd sleep beside strangers, snore in harmony, risk fleas, lice, and the occasional dagger. And still people came. Because the tavern offered something rare. Escape. From taxes, from the church, from your own life. It's no surprise, then, that the church hated them. Preachers railed against taverns from the pulpit. Houses of sin, temples of drunkenness, the devil's waiting room. And to be fair, the devil may well have had a booth there. Brothels and taverns were often twins, sharing walls or owners. A man could lose his soul, his money, and his pants before sunrise. Yet despite the condemnation, the tavern endured. Like weeds between cobblestones, they flourished wherever people gathered. By the late Middle Ages, it wasn't unusual for a small village of 300 people to have 2 or 3 taverns. Why? Because not all were equal. There were inns, places that served travelers, often offering beds. Alehouses smaller, local haunts where the drink flowed fast, but food was rare. And then taverns, somewhere between, more social, more dangerous, more fun. And the games? Dice was king. Bones carved with dots, rolling across tables sticky with spilled mead. Gambling was everywhere, illegal. Often. But enforcement was rare unless the loser was rich. Then, suddenly, it became a matter for the sheriff. Cards didn't become common in Europe until the 14th century, and even then, they were hand-painted luxuries. If someone pulled out a deck, you knew they had money or had stolen it. And the songs, they were filthy. Minstrels weren't the clean, harp-strumming poets of courtly myth. They were wandering storytellers, part jester, part newsman, They sang of cuckolded lords, ugly princesses, drunken saints, and animals who did things no animal should ever do. The crowd would roar, slapping the table, and once in a while, a noble might hear his own misdeeds echoed in a tune and send someone to quiet the minstrel, permanently. But the tavern didn't care. It was a beast that couldn't be tamed. It grew fatter with every plague, every war, every bad harvest. When famine struck, men drank their sorrow. When kings died, they toasted their passing. When rebels plotted, they whispered behind their mugs, and sometimes, those whispers turned to flames. In 1381, in England, taverns were the hotbeds of the peasants' revolt. It was in the taverns that angry men shared tales of tax and justice, of lordly cruelty, of dreams that ended in broken backs and broken promises. And from those smoky rooms, a storm was born. But even revolutions grow quiet, and when they did, the tavern remained, waiting, listening. So here we are, back at the door, The fire's dying. The last drink is poured. A man sleeps with his head on the table, snoring through his toothless mouth. The barmaid counts her coins in silence, fingers moving like tired spiders. You step outside. The wind is colder now, but your heart is warm. You've been to a medieval tavern, and somehow you survived. And we've barely begun. Because this is a world of long-lost flavors, forgotten rituals, ancient gossip, and secret lives where even the most mundane moment could turn into legend. Where the past isn't dead, it's drunk, it's laughing, and it's sitting right next to you. So settle in. The night is long, and the ale never stops flowing. The door shuts behind you, muffling the distant roar of laughter and lute strings. But memory lingers, and as you walk the rutted lane beneath a moon cloaked in mist, your thoughts still buzz with everything left unseen. Because for all the spit and noise of the tavern hall, the real story's the ones passed in whispers between swallows of bitter ale hid in the cracks. Let's return, not just to the tavern itself, but to the people who ran it. You might assume the average tavern keeper was a man. Burly, loud, possibly armed. But you'd be wrong more often than you think. Across the medieval world, especially in towns, women held the keys to the ale. Alewives, they were called half-brewers, half-bosses, wholly feared. The alewife brewed the drink herself, sometimes in her own home, sometimes in small attached kitchens behind the tavern. She kept the fires lit and the cauldrons boiling, tasting the ale not with delicate precision, but with blunt instinct. And when it was done thick, cloudy, sour, and strong, she hoisted the barrel herself. This wasn't drink for sipping. It was liquid bread, laced with herbs, heavy as guilt. Alewives were respected by some, resented by others. They made money, they had influence. They could ban a man from the tavern with a snap of their fingers. But power, as always, breeds suspicion. And so the medieval church and town officials watched them carefully. Too carefully. In England, many alewives were forced to wear the ale stake, a pole with a bush of hops on the end, hanging outside their door. It was meant to signal ale for sale, but it also marked them sometimes for praise, often for scorn. Gossip followed. Accusations of watered ale, of cheating scales, of secret sins. It's no accident that the image of the ale stirring her cauldron, luring men with charms eventually bled into the image of the witch. But they weren't witches. They were entrepreneurs, survivors, and many taverns owed their reputation to the woman who stood behind the bar, arms crossed, daring anyone to start trouble. Trouble, of course, always came. Tavern fights were so common they barely merited notice. A spilled drink, a misheard word, a long grudge reawakened, and suddenly two men were rolling on the floor, fists flying, knives drawn, blood on the straw, chairs smashed, teeth. Sometimes someone died. If they were poor, the body was dragged out back. If they were rich, it was politics. There are court records. Endless, dusty, extraordinary court records. Like the one from Lubeck 1491, where a wealthy merchant was stabbed in a tavern over a game of draughts. His opponent? His own brother. The cause? A comment about their dead father's mistress. The result? The brother claimed madness, walked free, and opened a tavern of his own. And then there was the case from Toulouse, 1326. A tavern worker accused of poisoning a noble's wine. She swore innocence, claimed he was already drunk. A priest backed her. So did the town midwife, but the noble's family wanted blood. She was drowned in the river that night. Some say it was justice. Others whisper the noble had enemies on. She took their secret to her grave. Taverns, you see, were where truth went to get blurred. If you were a spy in the medieval world, You didn't sneak around castle walls in the dead of night. You went to the tavern. You drank. You listened. You paid for stories with ale or favors. The smartest kings had spies on every bar stool. And the most dangerous rebels used the same tools. Take the Hussite Wars in Bohemia early, 1400s. The radical preacher Jan Hus, burned as a heretic, inspired a massive rebellion. But before the battles, before the sieges, the first sparks lit in taverns. There, priests and peasants, knights and smiths, sat side by side, arguing doctrine over dark ale, faith, fire, and fury all brewing in those smoky corners. Even love, yes, even love found root in the tavern. Not courtly love, the kind sung about by troubadours with satin sleeves. No, this was a cruder, realer thing. A glance across the bench. A shared jug. A clumsy dance by the fire. And then maybe a night spent upstairs, if the tavern had rooms or just behind the haystack outside. Sometimes it led to marriage. Often it led to nothing but gossip. Occasionally it led to children no one admitted. But if you think the tavern was only for the common folk again, you'd be wrong. Even kings drank in disguise. Edward IV, they say, once disguised himself as a squire and wandered into a London alehouse to hear what his subjects really thought of him. He came away amused and disturbed. One man praised the king's policies. Another cursed his taxes. A third claimed he'd seen the queen naked through a castle window. Edward said nothing, drank his ale, and left. The third man vanished a week later. Then there's the tale of Charles VI, of France the Mad King. In his lucid days, he'd dress as a peasant and drink quietly in Paris taverns, listening to stories of himself. Some feared him, some pitied him. Some mocked him, and in one instance, a tavern-goer drunkenly declared, "The king is touched by demons." The next morning, the tavern was burned to the ground. But if monarchs wandered into taverns to listen, poets wandered in to write. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales begins, of course, in a tavern, the Tabard Inn. And it wasn't just a narrative device. Chaucer knew these places. He'd seen them. He'd drunk in them. His pilgrims a knight, a miller, a reeve, a pardoner, a bawdy wife earned court caricatures, their tavern stock. They're real. The kind of people who laugh too loud, sin too hard, love too fierce. Taverns, in their own way, were the first theaters. And the tavern was more than the drink. It was the stories. The lies and truths told so many times they changed places. One man might say, he killed 3 wolves with a single arrow. Another, that he slept with a lady of the court. The truth? Likely none of it. But in the haze of smoke and drink, it didn't matter. The crowd would cheer, demand more. And for a few golden minutes, the speaker became a hero. That hunger for story, that need to escape kept the tavern alive, even in the face of plagues. During the Black Death, some taverns shuttered. Others flourished. Why? Because when death walked the streets, people drank harder, danced faster, loved messier. They weren't fools. They knew the coughing man beside them might not live the week. So they filled their nights with noise and light and ale, and for a little while, they forgot. And through it all, the tavern endured. The walls cracked. The floor sagged. The names changed. But the soul of the place remained. And centuries later, when the Renaissance rose and the world shifted beneath it, when kings wore lace and the church wore gold, when printing presses buzzed and new lands were discovered, the tavern still stood. Quieter, perhaps, but still full. Because people still needed to gather, still needed to laugh, to drink, to belong. The medieval tavern is gone now. The wood has rotted, the fire has died, the songs have faded. But if you close your eyes in the right pub, if you listen past the clinking glasses and modern music, you can almost hear it. A drunk man cursing in Middle English. A woman laughing too loudly. A lute string plucked in defiance. The echo of stories that refuse to die. And we're still not finished. There's more to tell. The secret codes carved into tavern walls. The ghost stories whispered by the hearth. The drinking rituals of guilds and mercenaries. The monstrous drinking contests that ended in madness. The dark superstition of the drowned cask. The sin-eaters. The poisoners. The haunted ale. But that's for the next hour. For now, lean back. Let the fire crackle. Let your eyes close. The tavern isn't gone. It's just sleeping. And the ale is still warm. Hours pass like smoke drifting toward the rafters. The world outside the tavern is asleep, or dead, or dreaming. And here inside, in the final hours before dawn, the mood begins to change. The raucous laughter has softened into murmurs. The dice have stopped rolling. Only the truly broken or truly cursed remain now, cradling mugs and mumbling at ghosts. This is when the stories begin to twist. They say every tavern has a ghost. Not because the building is haunted, but because someone always dies here. Quietly, violently, forgotten. Maybe it was the barmaid who vanished one winter after the landlord's son returned from war. Maybe it was the thief who drank too much, boasted too loudly, and never left. Maybe it was the pilgrim who whispered secrets to the wrong monk. No one remembers their names, only the shape of their stories. In the dark corners of Europe, they called these spirits taverns. Not ghosts, not demons, just shadows who couldn't leave. If your drink tasted of rot, if the fire cracked without wood, if you heard your name whispered by no one, that was a tavern guest. And there were rules for them. Leave a drop of ale in your mug for the dead. Never sit in the far left seat by the hearth. Don't sleep on the straw nearest the chimney. Old superstitions, pass from drunk to drunk, barmaid to boy. Laughable, maybe, until you broke one. In 1298, in a tavern outside Prague, 3 men vanished in the night. No struggle. No blood. Just their boots left neatly beneath the table. The tavern was renamed the Silent Three. It burned down in 1301, rebuilt, and burned again. No one drinks there now. But the cellar door is still sealed shut, iron-nailed and buried in salt. Coincidence? Maybe. But then again, every tavern had that story. But not all stories were dark. Some were ... otherworldly. You see, the medieval tavern was more than just a place for mortals. In the far reaches of Wales and Brittany, they told of the Five Taverns. Hidden inns that appeared only to the lost. Lit by blue fire. Staffed by silent figures. If you drank their ale, you might wake 3 centuries later, dusty and unchanged, in a world where your name meant nothing. One tale written down by a monk in 1362 speaks of a soldier who followed the sound of music deep into the forest. He found a tavern, drank, danced, fell asleep. When he woke, his sword was rusted through, his skin pale, his hometown a ruin. He was cursed, they said, to wander from inn to inn, always drinking, never aging, never dying. They called him the Thirst. Others tell of tavern devils not in the form of horns and pitchforks, but as charming strangers with endless gold and no shadow. They paid for drinks they never touched. They smiled too wide. If you followed them out, you weren't seen again. The Alewives knew them, called them by ancient names, burned bitter herbs when they entered. And then there was the ritual of the third pour. Rare now. Forgotten by most, but once, in rural taverns, The third mug of ale poured for a stranger was never handed over immediately. It sat, watched. The stranger had to say a rhyme. From stone or fire, I come not near. Give me drink if I bleed in fear. If he refused, the mug was spilled. The man asked to leave. Some say those who broke the ritual were never seen in sunlight again. But it wasn't all fear and fairy. Sometimes, it was madness. Guilds, those powerful brotherhoods of craftsmen held drinking feasts in taverns that spiraled into chaos. These were called feast nights. The rules were absurd. You could only speak in rhyme, or only in Latin, or not at all. If you laughed, you drank. If you cried, you drank more. The drunkest was crowned king of fools and given power over the room. He could order dancing, kissing, fights, fines, marriages, all temporary, all binding until sunrise. One such night in Bruges ended in 14 arrests, 2 weddings, and the disappearance of a bishop's mule. The mule was found 6 days later in a convent stable, wearing a velvet cap and drinking watered wine. No explanation was ever offered. And then there were the songs. Not the body tunes of earlier hours, but the midnight songs. Soft, slow, carried by one voice, joined by others. Old songs. Forgotten languages. Melodies that made men cry without knowing why. The kind of songs that felt older than stone. One such song, preserved in fragments, speaks of a tavern beneath the hill, where the dead toast the living with bones for mugs. Scholars call it metaphor, but the old drinkers, they say otherwise, that on certain nights, if you follow the wrong road, you might find it, and drink forever. Still think the tavern was just a place to get drunk? No. It was a portal, a stage, a sanctuary, a trap, a theater of the sacred and profane. And like all great stages, it had its players. The drunken priest, blessing the ale as if it were holy wine. The penniless knight, trading stories for supper, his sword pawned long ago. The mute girl, carving symbols into the table with a nail, watching everyone. The retired torturer, quiet, polite, always sitting with his back to the wall. The midwife, drinking alone, humming lullabies to no child. The boy with the burned hands, who never took his gloves off. And in every tavern, always the man who didn't belong. No one knew his name. He never paid. But no one dared ask him to leave. He knew too much. Laughed at the wrong times. Looked too closely at things no one spoke of. He still shows up. They say, new face, same eyes. But maybe those are just stories. Maybe you've heard too many. Maybe the ale is catching up to you. Or maybe you've always known the truth. That a medieval tavern was not just a building of wood and stone. It was a mirror, a confession, a crucible. And if you stay long enough, really stay, past the fire, past the dawn, past the last heartbeat of sleep, you'll meet yourself there. Not the version that nods and smiles and pays taxes. The real you. The one that drinks, and remembers, and listens, and sings. But don't worry, we've still got ours to go. And the next chapter, that's when the wars come. When soldiers fill the taverns like wolves around a kill. When love becomes currency and betrayal is bought in silver. When kings drink beside corpses, and barmaids carry knives. We'll walk through the 30 Years' War, and see what happens to a tavern when the world ends over and over again. And somehow, keeps on drinking. But that's another mug. Let me know if you're ready to keep going. The night's still young. And the ale is still warm. Always. The barrel's not empty yet, and neither are the shadows. UV lingered long enough in the hearth glow of lore. Now let us throw the door wide to a darker chapter still, where history bleeds into horror, and the tavern becomes not just a place to sleep, but a witness to the collapse of all things civil, sacred, and sane. The fire flickers low. The benches are sticky with sweat, wine, and old blood. The candles have burned down 2 soft stubs. The air smells of iron and breath. You are no longer in the tavern you entered. You are in a war tavern now. Not the kind found on maps or named in family deeds. These taverns bloom like fungus in the wake of violent sun, the edge of burned villages. Beside makeshift camps, inside shattered chapels and ruined granaries. Where soldiers outnumber prayers, where coin is melded a ring, where screams are closer than hymns. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. A war so long, so pointless, and so brutal that even the plague asked it to calm down. Entire regions of Central Europe were eaten alive. Villages disappeared, never forests grew over bones. But where there was death, there were soldiers. And where there were soldiers, there were taverns. These were not cozy places. Imagine a collapsed monastery in Bohemia, its altar dragged out and used as a bar counter. Wine stored where relics used to rest. Ale brewed in baptismal fonts. The floor covered not with rushes, but with straw soaked in gunpowder and ash. The men who drank here were broken in body and mind. Not knights in polished armor, but mercenaries. The flotsam of Europe, Walloons, Croats, Swedes, Saxons. Some barely spoke the same language. All knew the taste of rot. These were the taverns where coins clinked 1 minute, and throats were slit the next. Where a man might trade his own child for a bottle. Where priests wept as they poured drinks, muttering prayers that no one remembered. And yet, even in these hellholes, ritual survived. One such tavern, recorded in a soldier's diary near the Rhine, had a tradition. Before drinking, each man had to name someone he'd killed. A name, a place, a weapon. If he couldn't, he paid double. If he lied and was caught, he died. It was called the tolling mug. No one knows what became of it. Some say it was raised by the Swedes. Others say it was swallowed by the earth after the roof caved in during a thunderstorm on the night every mug cracked in unison. Another war tale comes from the siege of Magdeburg, 1631. The city was destroyed utterly. Over 20,000 civilians were massacred. The rivers ran red. And yet, in the final hours, as the fires consumed the churches, a group of townsfolk barricaded themselves in the cellar of a tavern. They drank, they say, as the city burned above. They sang. They told stories. They passed around a single candle until the air ran out. Their bodies were found much later still seated, still smiling. The tavern was rebuilt. The cellar sealed. The new owner reported hearing singing from below every year on the anniversary. Now, not all war taverns were so doomed. Some thrived. Entered the Camp Taverna, traveling hellcart pulled by mule or woman, with barrels lashed to the sides and sacks of stolen bread swinging beneath. These mobile dens followed armies across Europe like parasites. When battles ended, they opened within the hour. The serving girls, often widows of the freshly dead, or looters in disguise, or spies. One woman, Red Greet, was said to have poisoned generals from 5 nations over 2 decades, each in a different tavern, each with the same line. Let me sweeten that for you. No one caught her. No one tried. Soldiers feared her more than bullets. They also loved her. Half the army carried poems written about her. Crude ones, yes, but passionate. And speaking of poison, that brings us to the glass of spite. This was a phrase whispered in the corners of the most dangerous war taverns. It referred to a final drink, offered free, always with a smile to someone the bartender or owner wished gone permanently. usually spiked with deadly nightshade or henbait. Sometimes it wasn't meant to kill, just to change a man, bend him, break him. In some cases, that drink triggered visions. There are reports too many to ignore of men who drank the spike glass and emerged days later, raving about devils that walked on two legs, tavern mates with glowing eyes, mugs that whispered secrets when full, and rats that laughed in Latin. These accounts were dismissed. Of course, delirium, war madness, bad grain, but they share eerie similarities. And then there are the markings. Scratched deep into beams and tabletops across Europe are strange symbols, geometric shapes, spirals, intersecting arrows, and crude images of eyes. Always eyes. These weren't mere doodles. Some scholars believe they were protective wards. Others believe they were sigils, marks made by secret societies, cults, or lost warlocks who roamed the post-battle plains. One such table, preserved in a museum in Salzburg, bears a phrase written in a dozen languages: drink and forget, drink and remember. Either way, it finds you. No one knows what it is. Perhaps it's best not to ask. But amidst the blood and curses, there were still strange lights of humanity. Taverns that became hospitals of a kind, where wounded from both sides drank together in silence, knowing no doctor was coming. Where enemies shared the same stool, hands shaking too badly to draw blades. One story tells of a Spanish musketeer and a Dutch pike soldier who drank together during a lull in battle. They never spoke, just passed a jug back and forth. When fighting resumed, they found each other again, this time on the field. The Spaniard lowered his musket. The Dutchman smiled. They turned, walked away from the war together, and disappeared. They were last seen in a tavern in Bruges, playing chess. Maybe that's true, maybe not. But it feels like it should be. Because the tavern, in its strangest hours, became a kind of church. A crooked sanctuary, where sins were confessed without judgment, where the lost were found, where the dead sometimes whispered, and the living sometimes listened. But all things end. And as the 30 Years' War burned itself out, devouring millions, the war taverns crumbled. Some were buried, some were cleansed with holy water. Some, it's said, were swallowed into the ground, leaving only empty fields where singing can still be heard. What came after was quieter, but not cleaner. The tavern of the 1700s would change again. More polished, more political. The age of revolutions loomed. The age of public discourse. Of revolutionaries in powdered wigs, whispering sedition over mulled wine. And yes, we'll go there next. We'll sit beside Robespierre and Danton in the of Paris. We'll watch America plot its birth, and taverns thick with pipe smoke and treason. We'll hear the bell ring in Boston, ask Green Dragon Tavern, and feel the slow pulse of rebellion. But that's a new era. This hour belongs to the haunted, to the blood-soaked benches, to the cursed mugs, to the eyes scratched into stone. And to you, still sitting here, still listening, long past the point most would have fallen asleep. But that's the truth of these tales, isn't it? The longer you stay, the more you start to remember.